Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wolfson. I'm a professor of English literature at the University of Ottawa, and this channel provides videos of some of my lectures from courses I teach at the university, as well as other detailed introductions and reflections on the great works of literature and philosophy of the Western tradition. So if you like that content, please subscribe to the channel, like the video. That helps others find the content. So this video is an introduction to Daniel Defoe's legendary novel, Robinson Crusoe. So let's get started. So the novel was published in 1719, and I think most people know this work. Even if they haven't read the novel, I don't think most people have read the novel, but people know of the work through other avenues. It was instantly a bestseller. This tale seemed to captivate readers right away and has ever since, of this sole survivor of a shipwreck, stranded alone on an island for 28 years, and then finally finding his way back. And we different versions of this have been adapted recently, well, relatively recently, a few years ago, a movie called The Martian, where we have this playing out and someone stranded on Mars, and the novel itself has been translated over 100 languages. So as I said, a well-known story, even though I think most people haven't actually read the novel itself. The novel is a first example, I would say, of that genre, of the form of the novel. We'll talk a bit about that as well. And probably in the background, what maybe most people don't know is it points to older forms, more, let's say, medieval literature of spiritual allegory. So it's really about, Defoe wants us to think that part of the story is about Robinson Crusoe's struggles and finding God. However, what I'm also going to demonstrate is that the novel points forward to modernity in as much as it really shows and Robinson Crusoe and the way he operates on the island in the context of modern natural philosophy as well as modern political philosophy. So one way of thinking about it is Crusoe's actions and deepest passions undermine his religious interpretation of his own story. So his fixation with money we'll look at, for instance, his fixation with self-preservation, etc., seem to trump in every instance any religious interpretation of the event that he may later want to put on it as he tells this story in the past tense. So in this way, the novel's combining a searching need for a religious explanation of our existence and combining it with uh, an undermining of that with a secular rationality. So this combination, I think, makes the novel relevant and powerful for us today in the modern world. So hopefully, even if you haven't read the novel, hopefully today's discussion will spark you to want to go pick it up. So the author, Daniel Defoe, who is he? He was, you see his dates there, 1660 to 1731. He was born Daniel Foe, born in London, and he added the B-E part to his last name because it would make his last name sound more aristocratic sounding. He's from a middle class Puritan family, and he had a varied career. He writing as a journalist, as writing was involved in political espionage, and let's say wrote in a number of mercenary ways, just trying to make money. And in this way, he was seen as a representative of a burgeoning bourgeois class of writers by especially some of the more well-known 18th century authors that are coming from a more aristocratic literary background. They see him as representing a new moneyed and well, new money and writing on various political topics for money as opposed to let's say, the search for truth or beauty. For instance, Alexander Pope said, quote, "The first part of Robinson Crusoe is very good. Defoe wrote a vast many things, and none bad, though none excellent, except this." So kind of a backhanded compliment there. And maybe even worse, Jonathan Swift said, "One of these authors, the fellow that was pilloried, I forgot his name, is indeed so grave, sententious, dramatical a rogue that there is no enduring him." So he was, as the Swift quote there referred to, he was pilloried. So you see him in the stocks there under Queen Anne for a satire he had written on the government's intolerance of religious dissenters. So he was defending the his he felt the right of religious dissenters, including Puritan groups such as his own family's religious point of departure. So if we were to look at the sources of Robinson Crusoe, what types of stories is it building on? First of all, it's building on real travel tales. For instance, the story of Alexander Selkirk, a 1704 Scottish sailor who was marooned on an island and lived there for 4 years. Utopian literature, so Thomas More's Utopia, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, political philosophy in the form of discourses on the state of nature. So in the 17th century, famously, Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, John Locke in Second Treatise of Government had tried to think of a hypothetical state of nature where humans existed before society. And we see this enacted in Robinson Crusoe, alone on the island without society. What is the state of nature? What are the rights that belong to a human in that state of nature? And then the other, let's say, category of genre that Defoe is building on is spiritual biography or allegories. So probably most fundamentally there, Augustine's Confessions written in 397, and then more immediately to Defoe, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress in 1678. In terms of context of where Defoe's Robinson Crusoe fits within the literary tradition, the English literary tradition, you see here Defoe in this period of restoration in 18th century literature is usually a literary period set off from, let's say, the Renaissance that preceded it and Romanticism that comes afterwards. And I have introductions to those periods in other videos. So I mentioned that it's could be thought of as the first novel. So sometimes people will say Don Quixote could be the first novel, but I would think it's better considered a romance tale, more in line with medieval and Renaissance romances than the modern novel. And I would say, Robinson Crusoe is probably the best starting point of the novel. So what is a novel? Usually defined as fictional prose that is extended work, like an epics, a longer work, unlike short lyric poetry or later on short stories. It's fictional, so unlike a theoretical philosophical treatise or treatise of natural philosophy, and it's prose. It's not in poetic form, such as epic, drama, and lyric. However, with that definition, it would still include long works of prose fiction that we would normally not call novels. So Socratic dialogues, if they're narrated dialogues, are extended works of prose fiction. The Republic is an example. Prose romances, such as Mallory's Mort d'Arthur, or as I would say, Don Quixote, building on these Arthurian legends. So what distinguishes it? And a lot of this owes to a scholar named Ian Watt, who wrote the Rise of the Novel, an important work in thinking about the history of the novel. And one element of the novel as a genre form that stands out from those other works of extended fictional prose would be realism and adherence of the novel of to reality as defined by the material particular objects of our experience. So, and also moving from universal, trying to think about, say, universal allegorical figures to the particular, and original plots. That's where we get the word novel or new. So, original plots as opposed to building on previous legends, and individualism. So it foregrounds the experiences, the inner thoughts and developments of individual characters as really the motor of the work. The novel rose in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, rose with the development of print, the printing press and print culture that developed a reading public. And the novel provided this new art form to supply material for this broader middle class reading public. So before, if we have only the very elite who are educated enough to read, and that they're reading works that are manuscripts written, handwritten, so they're very expensive. Only the extremely wealthy, elite would be able to read in the first place. Now we have this broader public that maybe don't have the background in classical philosophical training that these aristocratic readers would have had in the past. So what are we going to provide them? Are they going to be reading Thomas Aquinas? Are they going to be reading Plato or reflections on Plato that are deep and profound? Let's try to provide them with something that's more what we would call pulp fiction. Let's say, let's provide them with something that's more easily digestible. And this is, the novel supplies that. A note on, if we see here, let's say the history of the novel and the condensation of the story time represented in novels. So this is based on an excellent study by Ted Underwood. You can see the citation on the side here, where he and his team went about trying to study, on average, about how much story time, events described in the story, how much time is taking place in those stories in an average page or so, 250 words. And you can see at the beginning of the novel's history, where 1719 with Robinson Crusoe, we have maybe weeks, months being represented. And then towards more recent time of the novel's history, that has been condensed down to minutes. So really the only story that's taking place, the amount of time in the story that's taking place in about a page of narration in the novel has been condensed to about 6 minutes from weeks. So in Robinson Crusoe, he'll say, oh, and then I realized on the first day I had to do this, so I started the laborious task of cutting down some smaller trees to build posts. And then by the third day, I realized this. So in a page, he can cover maybe a week's worth of his work on average. In more recent novels, the focus is on the inner thoughts of the characters and how they are reacting to a situation in the moment increasingly. So this, we have a, say, a condensation of story time, but also a compression of the amount of meaningful connections that an individual is able to draw from their own actions, words, and thoughts to the outside world. While we're talking about, let's say, the history of the novel and Robinson Crusoe as one, a little bit of a rant on my part on what you see in terms of the great books of that are often listed on the internet. So I have the link here to one such aggregate site that uses an algorithm to crawl. So it's pretty interesting this way to go and crawl all other great books lists and tabulate them to say, okay, well, here's, let's say, the definitive list. If you look at all the other lists of the greatest books of ever written of all time, and you have hundreds there that are listed. I just did an analysis of the top 100, and 88% of them are novels, and they're, I forget exactly how much, but about 80 or 90% of that top 100 are written in the last two centuries, so the 20th century or the 19th century. So first of all, there's an extreme focus on recent works where we can see the top 10 listed there. Where's Homer? Where's Shakespeare? Where's any of the classical authors? They're not there because our focus has shifted so extremely to the present. Our historical, our depth of historical horizon has been narrowed to the present. And they're almost all novels. In the top 10, they're all novels. But in that, as I said, you look at the top 100, about 88% are novels. So we think of a book that you would read as as a novel. That's become our defining feature because it is the modern genre, but we're completely forgetting, let's say, great works of philosophy. We're forgetting epic. We're, again, Homer, Paradise Lost, Virgil's Aeneid. We're forgetting works of religious reflection, Aquinas, Augustine. We're forgetting great works of natural philosophy, Newton's work on the on the universe based on mathematical principles. These are great works. If we're talking about the greatest books of all time, it can't just be novels and it can't just be from the last 150 years. That's my rant. I might do a video that goes in more detail into this list and why it's absolutely wrong in the near future. So we talked a bit about Robinson Crusoe as the first novel. Let's talk about Robinson Crusoe as a work of spiritual allegory or biography. So he begins with a preface. So the entire novel is is this character looking back over his sojourn and telling the story in the past, almost in a journal, so to speak. And it begins with a preface from a fictional editor who describes what you can see in this story. So according to the editor, the story is told, quote, with a religious application of events to the uses to which wise men always apply them. That is, to the instruction of others by this example, and to justify and honor the wisdom of providence in all the variety of our circumstances. Let them happen how they will. So the editor is telling us right off the bat that this is not just a story, it's not just an adventure. This is something that is being communicated in order to educate the reader to most profoundly to the wisdom of providence, God's providence. So providence, as we can see from this Bible dictionary, which I think is handy to help us reflect on it. So it literally means from Latin foresight, to see in advance, providere, but is generally used to denote God's preserving and governing of all things by means of second causes. So second causes, I'll just highlight that. So God was the primary cause, the first mover, let us say, in creating the universe, and maybe, let's say, a first cause in interventions in that universe. And maybe those interventions manifest themselves as miracles, however, and there can be debates about that. However, God also operates through second causes, secondary causes. So the secondary cause could be if we see, a tree falls and that happens to start a fire by some chance happenstance. The immediate cause of that is obviously these physical causes of the tree, etc. But this is really only a second cause to God's intention of having laid this all out in advance. God's providence extends to the natural world and the affairs of men and of individuals. It extends also to the free actions of men and things sinful, as well as to their good actions. So God's providence is behind all of this. So we can read it as a simple adventure story. And I think that's why it's become so popular. People do see it as an adventure story. It's adapted into children's versions of this. And the many references to God and providence can be overlooked, and in those adaptations are probably not mentioned at all. However, in many ways, the novel can't be understood outside of its religious framework. The journey is a spiritual journey. It's a spiritual biography or allegory meant to educate the reader. The, the spiritual biography, that as a genre focuses on real people. So a saint, a martyr, particularly pious individual. And note, even in fictional Robinson Crusoe, Defoe insisted on the reality of Crusoe and his experience. Thinking like, let's say, another spiritual biography is the life of Zosima, a little or the reflections on Zosima in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. So we have another saintly figure there who's supposedly real, and we get to learn about them in the course of that novel. So in the spiritual biography, there's a pattern in Defoe's time of general pattern of character denying God, repenting and converting, and then being delivered from sin by God's grace. So a related genre, spiritual allegory, would the protagonist is representative of humanity in general, is not a particular quote unquote real character. And so to here, even though we can recognize that Robinson Crusoe is based on kind of modern novelistic tendency towards focusing on realism, it also can be seen as participating in that allegorical tradition. So I won't go through this whole list, but you could see here, and these slides are, as with all the videos, the slides that I'm using are linked. The link to these slides is in the description. You can see in this list, for instance, being shipwrecked could be seen as an allegory of spiritual crisis, and this happens a couple times for Robinson Crusoe, so represents his crises, so to speak. So the whole novel could be seen as this spiritual journey. However, there are questions of the sincerity of this religiosity that we can see in Robinson Crusoe. His physical survival seems to be more important to Crusoe than his relationship to God. And despite the references to his faithful devotion to higher spiritual things, we can ask, is Crusoe more deeply concerned with amassing wealth and control of nature? So I think in these senses, he points towards the modern age. And first, let's look at Robinson Crusoe and modern natural philosophy. So I want to start with an episode that happens in the third month on the island. Crusoe discovers that stalks of barley and rice have started to miraculously grow on this island that didn't have them before. So at first, this discovery stirs religious thoughts in Crusoe. Who, quote, had hitherto acted upon no religious foundation at all. So he sees the growth of these plants, which would ultimately become critical for his survival and salvation, as a miraculous intervention akin to the virgin birth of Jesus. Quote, but after I saw barley grow there in a climate which I know was not proper for corn, and especially that I knew not how it came there, it startled me strangely, and I began to suggest that God had miraculously caused this grain to grow without any help of seed sown, and that it was directed purely for my sustenance on that wild, miserable place. So his first interpretation of the event is to see it as the pure productions of providence for his support, end quote, as a sign of the workings of the divine. And his first reaction is to greet it in a spirit of gratitude. So I think that's important, this reaction in a spirit of gratitude that this has been provided. So soon, however, he ascertains that there might be a natural explanation for this sudden growth. Quote, at last it occurred to my thoughts that I had shook a bag of chicken's meats out in that place, so chicken feed, and then the wonder began to cease. And I must confess my religious thankfulness to God's providence began to abate too, upon the discovering that all this was nothing but what was common. So that I love that phrase. Then the wonder began to cease. And with that phrase, Defoe provides us with an epigram on modernity, in my view. So the entire scene enacts this decisive dilemma of modernity by by taking natural causes and only natural causes as our sole cue for the understanding of the cosmos. We're left devoid of hope, gratitude, and wonder. The wonder began to cease. Crusoe is participating then in this modern philosophical revolution. He's part of that, in the revolution in the way we approach the world. And that approach begins in a radical break from the teleological assumptions of its classical predecessors. And now, just a word on what Leo Strauss calls the three waves of modernity. So we'll talk about the first wave in this lecture. I'll make another video that just talks about Strauss's notion of the three waves of modernity, and I think I talk about it in other lectures. But what's important for our purposes with Robinson Crusoe is to understand that for the classical tradition, nature, beings as a whole are understood only in are properly understood only in relation to the proper end or telos of that being, of that object within nature. So nature and the telos of nature is what we need to be directed towards. For instance, uh, we could say the eye has a purpose. It was designed with a purpose of seeing. Only within the context of understanding that end, that telos, that intention, can we understand what an eye is. With the beginning of the modern age, so let's say around 1500, we thinkers began to say, okay, well, let's look at the other causes, material causes, efficient causes, but let's ignore this teleological or final cause. There's too much supposition there. There's room for disagreements. But what we can focus on is what we can measure in this world and what we can control in this world. So this first wave of modernity is really building on the foundation of Machiavelli in political philosophy, Bacon in natural philosophy, and nature is still the standard as it was for classical thinkers. However, nature is studied outside of ends or intentions. And in the political realm, I'll note that that eventually provides the roots, that trying to think of how humans can exist together outside of trying to think of what the ends or the telos of humanity is, it provides the roots and the foundation of liberal republicanism. But in natural philosophy, Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, is the one who really kind of set the stage for this type of modern thinking. And he separates physical inquiry into material and efficient causes from the metaphysical inquiry into formal and final causes. So he wants us to focus less on those metaphysical inquiries and try to focus on these physical causes, material and efficient, the mechanical causes that we can understand in this world without kind of debate and without, let's say, relying on divine revelation that's always open for debate or without extrapolations of reason that are debatable. So for him, the search for final causes has been a perennial source of investigative confusion. And he says this in The Advancement of Learning. He says, the handling of final causes mixed with the rest in physical inquiries hath intercepted the severe and diligent inquiry of all real and physical causes, and given men the occasion to stay upon these satisfactory and specious causes, to the great arrest and prejudice of further discovery. So I think we could say that Robinson Crusoe, the novel, enacts this decisive movement of modern natural philosophy. Crusoe, we see it in action. This is a bringing forth of this movement in the actions of Robinson Crusoe, the character. Crusoe discovers the miracle of stalks of barley and rice. And this first leads him to see a telos in that. And then his reflections upon it further, he sees these phenomena. Ultimately, he determines that they can be explained. If we get rid of that metaphysical explanation, they can be explained solely by physical causes, the material cause, leftover seeds in a sack, and the efficient cause, him shaking it. Now, what he's forgetting, and remember this doctrine of providence, is sure, yeah, those may be let's say, the immediate physical causes, but they can also be seen as God's secondary cause. God was still be steering the ship, so to speak. He was behind these things. He, the seeds were left there for a reason, for a telos, for a purpose. I think this is what we forget generally in the modern age, and what Robinson Crusoe does in particular here. Let's look also in terms of Robinson Crusoe and modern political philosophy. So just as in natural philosophy, the elimination of final causes is kind of a main motor force. This is mirrored in modern political philosophy. This is again quote from Bacon. He said and it's one of the reasons he expresses an admiration for the thinking of Machiavelli. He says, "We are much beholden to Machiavel and others that write what men do and not what they ought to do." So rather than from human ends and purposes, modern political thinking takes its point of departure from the supposed beginnings of humanity in a state of nature. So similarly, rather than our highest potential and a divinely guided reason, modern political philosophy takes its point of departure in humanity's basest passions. It's precisely these base passions that provide the ground and ruling principle for Crusoe's thoughts and actions. And I want to look at a couple of examples of this. So, despite his forestalled conversion that we described earlier with the incident with the barley and rice that were growing, his conversion does eventually take place. He goes through a serious illness and is eventually delivered from that serious illness. And he begins a regimen of reading the New Testament. And he says, "When it happened providentially," that word again, "the very day that reading the scripture, I came to these words: He is exalted, a prince and a savior, to give repentance and to give remission." And this is from Acts 5:31, by the way. "I threw down the book, and with my heart as well as my hands lifted up to heaven, in a kind of ecstasy of joy, I cried out aloud, Jesus, thou son of David, Jesus, thou exalted Prince and Savior, give me repentance." I'll just highlight there that Robinson Crusoe's, let's say, this worldly interpretation of everything, including his religious conversion, is interesting. His focus on this world, on securing this world, whether it's wealth, his own self-preservation, is reflected even in his exclamation of joy at his conversion. He doesn't say, Jesus, Son of God. He doesn't say, Jesus, my Lord, in the sense of my God. He says, Jesus, Son of David, i.e., Son of David as in line to the throne of Israel, this worldly kingdom. And he says, thou exalted Prince and Savior. So he exalts the Jesus as this worldly ruler as opposed to otherworldly ruler. So even though he does have this moment of conversion, Crusoe's disposition of joy and hope in that deliverance that can be offered by dutifully offering himself to the will of God is always tenuously held. So fear ends up displacing religiously grounded hope. For instance, when he encounters a solitary naked footprint in the sand, and this is rightfully a famous moment in the novel. His response is not to pray for patience or for the wisdom to do God's will. Rather, Crusoe realizes that the dangers to his own self-preservation require enhanced efforts to master his environment. So he says, "Thus my fear banished all my religious hope." So So important. All that form confidence in God, which was founded upon such wonderful experiences I had had of his goodness, now vanished. As if he that had fed me by miracle hitherto could not preserve by his power the provision which he had made for me by his goodness. I reproached myself with my easiness, that would not sow any more corn one year than would just serve me till the next season, as if no accident could intervene to prevent my enjoying the crop that was upon the ground. And this I thought so just a reproof that I resolved for the future to have 2 or 3 years corn beforehand, so that whatever might come, I might not perish for want of bread. So we can see in Robinson Crusoe's reaction what would have eventually become diagnosed by Weber as the Protestant work ethic. So, one sense, we can have, let's say, a sense that there's a providential design, but there's definitely room for humans to provide for themselves. And we see in Robinson Crusoe a heightened, almost a, a hyper awareness of the need to secure our self-preservation, our wealth in this world. So going back to Thomas Hobbes, the grounding of our political arrangements and rights rests upon our basest passions, in particular the passion of fear. So just as we saw Robinson Crusoe being so arrested by his fear that when he saw that solitary naked footprint. This is Hobbes. Quote, the passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. For Hobbes, as for Crusoe, after seeing the footprint in the sand, fear leads to the rational calculation of how we can secure the means to our survival. So John Locke builds on this Hobbesian insight. And he agrees with the foundational insights of Hobbes on every one of his foundational points, but adds that security and self-preservation also require private property. So for Locke, it's by means of one's labor that the materials provided by nature, which are originally common to all, can be appropriated and become one's own. And he says this in Second Treatise of Government. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So we can see this also in the novel, in this notion what I call Crusoe's notion of the right of possession over the island. So fear drives Crusoe to secure the means of his self-preservation. Securing these means to self-preservation becomes his sole end, and he secures them through diligent toil on the island. And by means of this toil, he believes he has a certain right of possession over the island and its contents. Quote, I descended a little on the side of that delicious vale, surveying it with a secret kind of pleasure, to think that this was all my own, and that I was king and lord of all this country, indefeasibly, and I had a right of possession, and if I could convey it, I might have it in inheritance, as completely as any lord of a manor in England. So this concern with securing the means of his self-preservation is also expressed in his strange fixation with money. And this is one of the stranger aspects I find of the novel. And I think Defoe's doing something here. I think he wants the reader to see in this part of let's say, a blind spot in Crusoe as a character. So, for instance, Crusoe is busy salvaging useful equipment from the ship that has stranded him on the island, and he discovers about 36 pounds value in money. And although it's not of any use in his predicament, and despite the trouble it will be for him to bring it to shore, Crusoe decides to take it in. Quote, I smiled to myself at the sight of this money. O drug, said I aloud, what art thou good for? Thou art not worth to me, no, not the taking off of the ground. One of these knives is worth all this heap. However, upon second thoughts, I took it away. So his fixation with money is also manifest in the fact that his deepest passions are reserved for the securing of wealth. So his most profound emotional responses, as we'll see, are when he discovers that he has become wealthy. When Crusoe is finally able to return to Europe, he immediately acquires into his claim to a plantation in Brazil. He discovers that this claim has made him a very wealthy man. And upon this discovery, he underscores how inexpressible his joy was at that moment. Quote, "It's impossible to express here the flutterings of my very heart when I looked over these letters, and especially when I found all my wealth about me. In a word, I turned pale and grew sick, and had not the old man run and fetched me a cordial, I believe the sudden surprise of joy had overset nature, and I had died on that upon the spot." So he was so overjoyed, he thinks he could have died of shock at that time if he had not had a cordial. So that's his homecoming. That's his, in the classical tradition, his nostos, his homecoming. So think of that in relation, let's say, to the homecoming of Odysseus, and the most famous epic of homecoming. So when we first encounter Odysseus, Calypso has kept him prisoner on her island for 7 years, and he's pining for home. And we have this quote from Book 5 of the Odyssey: "Off he sat on a headland, weeping there as always, wrenching his heart with sobs and groans and anguish, gazing out over the barren sea through blinding tears." So Odysseus is a shipwrecked sailor as well. He longs for home, and that homecoming is the entire story, of course. And rather than accept an immortal life offered by Calypso, a life which is not proper for humans, Odysseus chooses to return to his home because he sees meaning and purpose in his duties, as in his roles as husband, father, ruler. And it's this longing for homecoming and the incredible obstacles he overcomes that make the scenes of reunion and recognition when he does return home very powerful. So we have this powerful return home of Odysseus, and we have powerful scenes of him and Telemachus in book 16 weeping as they have their recognition. And we have the scene with another famous scene with Argus, his loyal dog who recognizes him, and of course is with Penelope. All of these are important scenes, and they're rightfully remembered and famous because they really have a power to affect the human soul, I would say. And they're they have an enduring power to affect the human soul, like few other works in Western literature. When we think of Robinson Crusoe, we don't think of the homecoming. The homecoming is not a powerful scene in Robinson Crusoe. It's powerful for him. He nearly dies out of shock when he finds out how wealthy he got. But that is not a powerful emotional scene, him being united with his accumulated wealth. It provides a contrast. If we think of Odysseus's return with with him and his community, with his loved ones, his relationships to others, and Crusoe is reunited with his wealth, his money. It's not as powerful, but it does, let's say, underscore the problematic of modern political thinking. So our duties and responsibilities to one another as a political community and as a family are replaced by our selfish passions. Our ends, our duties are replaced by these selfish passions as the basis of that, and our desire to secure the means of our self-preservation. So some concluding thoughts. I think we could say, I think the novel is important and profound for us in a lot of ways. And as I said, if you haven't read it, I urge you to read it, and hopefully the video has helped. But some concluding thoughts, you could say that all of our lives are figuratively lived in a solitary wilderness of a deserted island, unless we find an ultimate design or purpose to our journey, unless we're able to react with a deep sense of gratitude to the thousands of small miracles and blessings that make this life not only possible, but also beautiful and desirable. And then the novel can also help us see, is the possibility of finding this meaning and wonder in our existence undermined by the rationality of modernity in its various forms, just as it was for Robinson Crusoe? Could we say of the dawning of the modern age, as Robinson Crusoe says of his own naturalistic interpretation of the phenomena of the island, quote, then the wonder began to cease? So I'll stop there. I hope this was a useful video for you. And as I said, I hope it spurs you to want to read the novel. And all the best, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.